Okay, welcome back. This is the second lecture for Unit 5. In Unit 5, we started with talking about the Renaissance, and in the Renaissance, of course, we saw a whole lot of painting. Painting was a very important part of the Renaissance, so that makes sense that we would be talking about painting for our art medium for this unit. In fact, painting is such a big topic that we'll actually cover it twice. I'm going to be talking about painting for Unit 5 alongside the Renaissance, and then I'll be talking about it in Unit 6 alongside the Baroque. And so, so in this first lecture on painting, we're going to cover the different mediums of painting that were most used in the ancient world up to the Renaissance. And then in the second one, we're going to cover the media that either kind of started right around the Renaissance or were used in the 20th century. So, um, and some of the things that we're going to be talking about, basically the first thing we need to talk about is what is paint. And so paint is basically defined as pigment with a binder and a medium. And generally when we're talking about different types of painting, like, oh, we say that painting is an encaustic painting or that painting is a tempera painting, it is the difference between the binder and the medium that is critical. So for this lecture, we're going to be talking about fresco painting and then encaustic painting and tempera painting. And in each one of them, what is the binder and what is the medium is going to be sort of like the significant thing that defines both the look of that medium or look of that type of painting and define the way people work with it. Okay. Is there anything else on this first page that I need to cover? Right down at 5, I do want to mention that there are, even though we've broken this down into 2 lectures, and each one we're going to cover about 3 main types of painting. In it, we still, there's lots of types of painting that we're just not going to get around to talking about, like casein painting, for example, which is really interesting. So the first one we're going to be talking about is fresco painting. And fresco is defined as painting into wet plaster. So the artist, when they work on a fresco painting, they have to do 2 things. They have to get their paint ready, and their paint is basically going to be their pigment in a suspension of water. Although there are different types of ways that might be held in the water. And then the artist paints directly into a sort of a damp plaster section. So they have to put down the plaster section by section and then paint into that section. They can't paint while the plaster is too wet, but they also can't paint when the plaster is dry. It has to be just damp enough so that when they brush the paint on, right, the water and also the pigment get soaked right into the plaster. So in the case of fresco painting, the wall itself, the plaster, the same thing that is the mount, is also the binder because the paint soaks right into it. And the medium, on the other hand, is the water. So we've already looked at some fresco painting, right? We've seen both these examples when we talked about the Renaissance. We talked about Raphael. We'll talk about Raphael some more. The School of Athens is also a fresco painting, but I do think probably this is the most famous fresco painting in the world. But I also wanted to make sure that you saw that there was fresco in the 20th century, especially the muralists of Mexico, who really kind of revived the art of fresco painting. And there are still people today. I couldn't find an example of a contemporary artist using fresco that I was really pleased with, but there definitely are lots of artists today who are using fresco painting. So the next medium we're going to be talking about is encaustic. And literally it is painting with molten wax. So in this case, the wax is both the medium and the binder, right? The wax, you basically, to work with encaustic, you just have to heat the wax up, in a metal pot so that it's really hot, and then add the pigment and mix the pigment in, once again, as a suspension rather than as a full pure solution. Meaning that if you just let it sit, then eventually the pigment would settle to the bottom. But while it's mixed together, it functions as paint. And then you just brush it on with a brush. One of the things about working with encaustic is because you're working with very, very hot materials, it tends to destroy your brushes. But still, you can, for a while, you work with it with a brush and you apply it, and as soon as it starts to dry, it becomes solid and it holds that pigment in place. So here are some examples from the ancient world. I will just very briefly kind of explain these. One of the things to remember um, about the Egyptian world and about the Roman world, right, is that just because Egypt was part of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century CE, there was still a lot of Egyptian culture to the practices that people had. And one of the things that they tended to do is they tended to make a big deal about artwork for the dead. And so this new kind of hybrid culture that we have, which is half Egyptian, half Hellenistic Greek, and another half, I guess that's 3 halves, Roman. This new culture is coming up with this new kind of solution where instead of like these elaborately carved sarcophagus for a funerary, for like a coffin, they have much more simple sarcophagus that with very little adorned, but then mounted to the front of it is this painted portrait of the person. And most of the examples we have are painted portraits of young people. It seems like it was especially important to kind of capture the lifelikeness of when a young boy or young man died early. Um, it was very kind of significant and important to the Roman Egyptians. But we also see encaustic in the 20th century. And here's a really interesting piece by James Ensor called Fireworks, and a pretty famous piece by Jasper Johns, where he reproduces the American flag in encaustic. And there is something just about the translation, the change of the American flag into this very kind of stiff and textural material that that kind of changes our awareness of it. And then Three Flags is a pretty famous version of that body work that Jasper Johns was working on. And here are some examples of encaustic in contemporary art. Um, I didn't really know of many examples before we started this lecture, and although I'm pretty familiar with the work of Tim McCourt because he teaches at Mississippi State, and I used to work with him for a couple of years, and actually I own at least one. Yeah, I own a Tim McCourt painting, beautiful painting, and so this is a pretty recent Tim McCourt painting here, but probably the most well-known artist working in encaustic right now is Betsy Evie. Um, Although Tony Sherman, a Canadian artist, has built a different type of career with encaustic as well. All right, so next we're going to be talking about tempera, and we're getting pretty close to the 1 minute mark. So I'm going to probably pause it there because we're just going to finish with tempera, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how tempera transitions into oil paint. All right, thanks.